Good evening and welcome to the second Center for Urban Engagement lecture this year. Many of you may have been here earlier in the semester, or at Blanchard 339 rather, when we heard from Carlo Rotella about his new book on the south side of Chicago. Later in the year, in the spring semester, we'll hear from Junia Howell from University of Pittsburgh on the ways in which disaster relief policy impacts and exacerbates economic inequality in urban areas of the U.S. And we'll finish the year with a talk by University of Chicago's Reuben Miller. But tonight, for our second lecture in the series, we have Jamie Kalven. Jamie is a writer and human rights activist whose work in Chicago has included reporting on police corruption and brutality, improving the lives of those in public housing, and advocating for public access to documents on police misconduct. His reporting has received the 2015 Polk Award for local reporting, the 2016 Ridenauer Courage Prize, and the 2017 Hillman Prize for web journalism. Jamie is also the founder of the Invisible Institute, which through human rights documentation, investigative reporting, civil rights litigation, the curating of public information, conceptual art projects, and the orchestration of difficult public conversations, seeks to keep fellow citizens visible by resisting the forces that disappear certain individuals, populations, and places. Jamie has been the force behind the publication of two books, the first, A Worthy Tradition, Freedom of Speech in America, and the second, Working with Available Light, A Family's World After Violence. His work has also appeared in a variety of publications and has contributed to public and legal debate. For The Nation, Jamie wrote an analysis of Judge Robert Bork's First Amendment theory, which was referenced during Bork's nomination hearings to the U.S. Supreme Court. His reporting of police abuse at the Chicago Housing Project Stateway Gardens in 2005 led to a civil rights case, Bond versus Utreris, where his journalistic notes of the abuse Bond said she had experienced were subpoenaed, but Kalven refused to comply. Jamie then argued in Kalven versus City of Chicago that documents regarding complaints of police misconduct should be available to the public under the Freedom of Information Act. And in 2014, the court ruled in his favor, a ruling that civil rights lawyers called historic. His four-part series, Code of Silence, written for The Intercept, amounts to a book-length expose of the difficulties faced by those police who would try to uncover corruption in the Chicago Police Department. And on February 10th, 2015, in a piece titled 16 Shots, Jamie first reported discrepancies between police accounts of the killing of Laquan McDonald and the autopsy report, which told a very different story. It is no stretch to say that the investigation, trial, and ultimate conviction of Officer Jason Van Dyke for the murder of McDonald was spurred in large part by Kalven's article and other work of those who take seriously the task of public accountability. Before I ask you to join me in welcoming Jamie Kalven to Wheaton College, I do want to share with you something he just shared with me, which is an exhibit that they have put on at the Invisible Institute at Peterman Studio called 6 Durations of a Split Second, The Killing of Harith Augustus. Jamie has 2 articles at The Intercept on this recent killing in Chicago, and I'd encourage you to go read them. I also encourage you to see the exhibit at their site. You can learn more about it if you go look up 6 Durations of a Split Second. And we may arrange for some people to be able to see it in a special showing. So talk to me about that later. Thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Jamie Kalven.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you tonight. I think the place to start is with the observation that this fall marked the 5th anniversary of the murder of a child by a police officer on the streets of Chicago. The killing of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald, October 20th, 2014, 5 years. And I feel like this is a sort of a watershed moment in the city, and what I hope to do tonight is to look back and look forward from the perspective that's opened up, at this kind of inflection point. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean. I think there are perspectives that are now available on kind of what we've been through as a city and a society, and also on what lies ahead. Perspectives that were more elusive in the midst of unfolding dramas and events. And I'd like to use this occasion to try to tease some of those larger perspectives out. And I want to be sure to leave time to engage with you. I've had a series of really enjoyable and instructive conversations since I've been here at Wheaton, and I'm hoping for another one with you. I first heard the name Laquan McDonald probably a week to 10 days after the incident. And it was by way of somebody in law enforcement who reached out through a close colleague of mine to say, you remember that incident that was reported in the press last week? It's not at all what was reported. It was horrific. There is dash cam video that shows the incident. And this whistleblowing source also had information that enabled me ultimately to find a civilian witness to the shooting. What had been reported initially was based on a press release that was released under the letterhead of the police superintendent at that time, Gary McCarthy, probably within 3 hours, 3 or 4 hours of Laquan McDonald being declared dead. So in the middle of the night, they released a short statement, short text. I should have brought it. I should have thought to bring it. Very carefully constructed and kind of typical of this kind of statement from the police, to the effect that an aggressive offender with a knife had lunged at police officers, and an officer in self-defense and in defense of his fellow officers had shot him, and he died sometime later at a nearby hospital. That was the official narrative. And these statements are often cast in sort of the passive voice, in the sense that it almost said that Laquan McDonald caused his own death at the hands of the police. So all agency is assigned to the victim, or to the dead person, and the subject of the sentence, the police officer, virtually disappears from the construction. That was the official narrative, and that remained the official narrative for some 13 months from the time of the shooting. It's really important for me to say that I get so much credit for my reporting, as in the generous introduction just now, and I work hard as a reporter, but I and others played relatively small parts in a large drama that's unfolded in the city. There's one person who, if you take them out of the picture, none of this happens, which is the individual in law enforcement who was sufficiently concerned and disturbed that this case was not going to be adequately investigated by the agencies tasked with investigating police shootings, that he reached out to an investigative reporter. If that person is not, today we would not know the name Laquan McDonald. To this day, I haven't named that person, and there may never be occasion to. But, as we talk about the condition of the police department and police community relations, it's important to remember in this instance and in many others, the code of silence piece that we talked about, that some of the fiercest critics of policing as it's practiced in Chicago, and I assume one could generalize this beyond Chicago in other urban settings, some of the fiercest critics are within law enforcement. But we don't hear their voices. They're not in the public discourse. In any case, given the information from the whistleblower, I began to investigate a case that I would not have undertaken otherwise. I was aware of the incident. I'd read the news coverage and been uneasy just on the face of it. I've had that experience many times as a lifetime Chicagoan. But then, like everybody else, I turned the page. So I think, we sometimes get way too much credit as reporters. Reporters are always telling somebody else's story. And in this instance, the source was critical, as was the next person I met on this journey, a man whose name I can now say out loud, although, again, I protected his identity for a long time, a gentleman on the southwest side of Chicago, Jose Torres, who was a witness just by chance, was driving. The incident occurred at 41st and Pulaski on the southwest side of Chicago. Pulaski is a big artery, and he was driving north on Pulaski when his movement in the car was blocked by the police action that was unfolding. He stopped, and he had an unobstructed view of the incident. And one of the, for me anyway, and I think for a lot of reporters, one of the difficult things about doing the kind of investigative reporting I do is sometimes you have to insert in the service of a story of great public importance, you have to insert yourself into the private life of somebody who didn't choose to become a public figure just because they witnessed an atrocity. They didn't opt to be a public figure. So I actually stalked Mr. Torres for some time, waited outside his house, left notes for him, ultimately talked with his wife, and then finally one day he came to the door when I was there. And I remember it vividly because it was raining, lightly raining, and we've since become friends, and he's a person of great graciousness and hospitality. But our first encounter, I was sort of standing on the top step leading to his front door. He was standing in the front door. I'm in the rain, and we're having, an exchange. He was appalled, utterly appalled, freaked out to have me show up at his doorstep, because if I knew how to find him, who else knew? He was at that point really concerned about retaliation from the police. He didn't know what, he'd witnessed this terrible event. He didn't know what to think. But he was so fundamentally decent that as I was getting wetter and wetter, he couldn't help but ultimately tell me what he had witnessed. And that, on this sort of reporting journey, that was really the moment when I knew that there was something here, that this was a really significant story. He was so compelling and was almost talking to me against his will. It wasn't like he'd come with a story to tell. It was something I was extracting from him. And what he described, he couldn't see He couldn't see the officer who later proved to be Officer Jason Van Dyke, who was firing. But he, heard a shot or shots. It's hard to judge the number. Laquan McDonald fell to the ground. He didn't know that was the name, but the young man fell to the ground. And then he was haunted, as were other witnesses. Then there was a long pause, and the boy is lying on the ground, and then a barrage of shots, 16 in all, as many as 14 or 15 administered while he's on the ground, writhing in pain. And some of you will have seen the now famous video. So Mr. Torres was just, haunted by this. And a week or so after the incident, he felt compelled. He heard he saw coverage in the media. He personally felt compelled to go to the agency that investigates police shootings and tell his story. So after talking with him, I was all in on the story, and the next step in the process was to get the autopsy. And it now seems completely obvious that one would go after the autopsy. I'm pretty sure I'm the only reporter who tried to find out the content of the autopsy, which in retrospect, when you see how... So the press has a lot to answer for in how it sort of aids and abets the phenomena by which these incidents just kind of disappear. So initially publishing essentially the police blotter, the press release from the police, then 24 hours pass and the story has all but disappeared. And so that was sort of the space in which I was operating. I finally got a hold of the autopsy. And actually, there's another anecdote associated with that. My principal source was Tony Preckwinkle, a name some of you will know, the president of the Cook County Board. So one of the most powerful figures in Chicago and Cook County. And she's over the medical examiner's office. And I've long known her. She's been a source and a friend. And I went, before the autopsy was accessible through Freedom of Information Act request, they have to be sort of formalized over a period of months. I went to Tony and I asked her if she could find out the content, the sort of top-line content of the autopsy. She sent her then chief of staff, Kim Fox, who's now the state's attorney, to talk to the ME, the medical examiner. And I'm a runner. I run for all my life. And between Christmas and New Year's, 2014, 2015, went out for a run in Washington Park, towards Washington Park in the south side. Snowy, dark, and Tony pulled up and beckoned me into her car. Didn't say hello, didn't say anything. She said 16 shots, front and back. That was the first time I heard 16 shots, which is, some of you who followed the case will know, became sort of the anthem. That's what was chanted in the streets. That was the title of the initial article I wrote in Slate. At that point, I started to report the case, to write, and I remember vividly, some 13 months after the incident, when the video came out, it was like this amazing political implosion that just changed the landscape of our civic life in Chicago, and I'll come back to that. I'm one of the few people for whom the video was not, it just didn't have that much impact, because I'd been grappling with this and trying to imagine what happened based on the witness testimony, and particularly the autopsy. And autopsies are really extraordinary documents. I don't know if any of you have ever had occasion to see them. They're kind of narratives. They are narratives. And so 16 independent gunshot wounds, each given a paragraph describing where the bullet entered, what bone, tissue, organ it touched, where it exited, if it exited. And as I said to a group of students I met with earlier today, the autopsy is as close as we'll ever get to having Laquan McDonald testify as to what happened. And I urge you to take a look at it. You can easily find it online. I made it universally available when I published. It's just instructive to see what that genre of an autopsy is. And for me, that was in some ways the most emotionally draining and affecting part of this, is just reading through repeatedly, trying to figure out how to render the autopsy for readers. Ultimately, I published in Slate, and this is now, I think, February 10th, 2015, so only a few months after the incident, and made known the existence of the video, which was later to figure so prominently. And the article, as an article, had, fairly dramatic impact. Nothing like the release of the video 10 months later, but at the time, it was really impactful. And what I was able to say was that I don't know what happened that night. I don't know what transpired at 41st and Pulaski, but I can definitively say that what the police said happened did not happen. There was no way to square the police account with the witness testimony and particularly with the autopsy. So, that suggests something about the nature of this kind of reporting, that I really think of my work as, in this and other instances, including significantly the Heath Augustus case, which I urge you to check out the Intercept articles or come down to the South Side and see our exhibition. I think of it as sort of pulling the skin back on the official narrative and kind of looking at how the official narrative is constructed. That narrative, aggressive young man lunged, police officer shot him in self-defense, he died sometime later. That narrative, that text, required a great deal of the city as time went forward. It required the falsification of police records. It required the intimidation of witnesses. There were witnesses to the shooting who were taken to a police station and held for 3.5 hours and subjected to the most browbeating sort of interrogation in which they were told, you can't possibly have seen what you say you saw. We have video that contradicts it. They invoked the video to try to, shake the eyewitness testimony of these individuals. Maintaining that narrative involved stonewalling the press, ultimately involved a $5 million settlement with the family of Laquan McDonald, conditioned on not releasing the video. The family's lawyers had gotten access to the video through the probate process that they needed to establish the estate of Laquan McDonald. And it turns out that there was a kind of circuitous route to get the video that they were themselves surprised, to have gotten it, and when they saw it, but they were barred from releasing it by the terms of the settlement. Much has been made in the course of the sort of public discourse about the case, about it being a cover-up. And I have consistently sort of contested that version of what happened. In a cover-up in sort of narrow terms, even though I understand why people use the word, and we don't have another word to use, I kind of get it. But a cover-up is a matter of a group of co-conspirators doing something they know is wrong, and then compounding the wrong by destroying evidence, suppressing information, committing other crimes. I wish this were a cover-up. I wish it were a cover-up. If it were a cover-up, then the solution would be to, vote political actors out of office, prosecute people as appropriate. If that's the diagnosis, then the prescription is to deal with those individuals. I think this was standard operating procedure. I think this was the norm. This is the way in which a kind of narrative machinery operates. And that's a much more daunting kind of diagnosis, but I think one that's sort of worth considering. I mean, I'm offering that for you to entertain, that really what we're up against and need to figure out how to address is a kind of narrative machinery that starts with a presumption of guilt on the part of the victim, and then is built through countless sort of small moves, and in the semantic realm, in physical actions. I was describing over dinner that after Harith Augustus was shot, and he may have been dead at the time, he was certainly dying, the first thing the police did was handcuff him. He's lying immobile on the ground. Now, that's the performance of his presumed guilt. It serves no practical purpose, but it does advance the narrative. It does advance the narrative. In the Laquan McDonald case, and there's a film that I urge on you, although I am part of it and co-produced it, called 16 Shots, that's streaming on Amazon and Showtime, that we made about the aftermath of and we end the film. At the very end of the hour-and-a-half film, we go back to the first moment of the narrative forming, which is an exchange between the dispatcher and officers on the scene. And the dispatcher is saying, "What's the condition of the victim?" And the officer says, "Offender." And the dispatcher says, "That's what I meant." It's that granular. And, we need a level of scrutiny of how that works. But it happens, across all sorts of cases. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that, every shooting is unjustified or anything of that nature. But I really think thinking in narrative terms about this is important. And what happened in the city of Chicago, is that pressure built. So after I published, every news organization sought the video. People start to be in the streets yelling, chanting 16 shots, 16 shots. Pressure's building and building and building and building and building and building and building. And ultimately, the machinery blew up. There was an extraordinary political implosion after the video was forced out and people saw it. And that video could have been released, in response to my initial reporting or at some other stage earlier. And the city would have had a rough week because of what it depicts, the horror that it depicts. But people's outrage was so compounded by the knowledge that the city had this information from the first moment. Everything we know now, after journalistic and legal efforts, everything we know now about what happened on October 20th, 2014, the police department and the city knew or had the means to know immediately. They had multiple civilian and police witnesses. They had the video. They knew they had the video. The autopsy was performed at 8:30 the next morning. It takes a while for an autopsy to be finalized. It doesn't take long to count to 16, to know the level the degree of brutality that was inflicted on this child. And so the knowledge that the city had known this and withheld it from the public just created a political implosion. And I think we now live out our civic life in Chicago in the sort of crater that was left by that implosion to this day. Think of all the things that the cascade of things that have happened that just flowed from that moment. Which really brings me back to this sense of a watershed, right now, at sort of the five-year point since this occurred. We've spent, and I think it's been productive and necessary. We've spent the last 5 years, or it's more like 4 years, once the revelations about the case came out, allocating blame. And that's really important. If you think about what the consequences would have been not to allocate blame, and that means Officer Jason Van Dyke is convicted of murder. Other officers are terminated through administrative processes. Anita Alvarez, the former state's attorney, is voted out of office because of her role. Rahm Emanuel doesn't run for a third term, in no small part because of this. So there are political, criminal, administrative forms of blame that are allocated. That's really important. And if you think about the public meanings that are created thereby, imagine if, as we had reason to imagine, and people feared, particularly in African American communities across Chicago, imagine if Van Dyke had been acquitted. Imagine that, alternative scenario, and you see how important it is that he was convicted. But his conviction didn't fix anything. Rahm leaving office didn't fix anything. And so I think, we're at this kind of fascinating point where we need to move from allocating blame to systems analysis and systems change. And there are a couple of several different models of this. One example is in medicine, there's something called Sentinel event investigations. So if somebody dies on the operating table or dies for a reason other than the expected course of their disease, then it's a common practice now in medicine, but only since the 1980s. I mean, this is a relatively recent phenomena, to intensely investigate what happened, not to allocate blame, but to reduce the probability of it happening again in the future. Or think about what the National Transportation Safety Board does. We've all seen, after an air crash, images of airplane hangars with the remnants laid out for investigation to reduce the probability that there will be a similar event in the future, to learn everything we possibly can learn from the disaster. We never do that with public policy. Least of all with policing matters. We never do that. We never do that kind of deep systemic analysis in the interest of reducing the probability that it will happen in the future. The third example of this kind of approach is truth and reconciliation in societies around the world with uneven results, but where there's an opportunity to move from a repressive, relationship of government to civil society to a more humane and liberal organization of society. And, what is attempted in these situations is to create public processes that lead to full public acknowledgement, and I think that word acknowledgement is key, of the realities of the society's history, of what has happened, in order to go forward, in order to address and remedy some of the underlying causes. And, when you think about it, human rights work, and certainly the way I think about our work, is all about knowledge. I think if there's a single driving principle in human rights work, it's that we are morally obligated. There's a moral imperative that we know what is possible to know about fundamental human rights abuses, about affronts to human dignity, and that we act on that knowledge. It's a principle that we fall short of constantly, and sometimes, in monstrous ways. But I think it's the right principle. And so, you think about policing in communities most affected by abusive and unconstitutional policing in urban America, which are, black and brown communities almost exclusively. The knowledge is there. People know. People know in those communities. Everybody knows in varying degrees and often from direct experience. But what's missing is the public acknowledgement of their lived experience, of their reality, and it's our reality more broadly. So, I think where we are now is at the kind of cusp of moving from allocating blame, Rahm did this, Van Dyke did that, to really thinking about the larger systems. And the tricky thing there, and the critical thing, is if we're thinking in this larger systemic way, then we also have to account for the ways in which we're part of those systems. And those systems don't exist apart from us. It's so much easier to project on the bad guys. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that that process isn't important, of holding people accountable in various ways. But it's critically important that we also reckon with the ways in which these problems don't exist apart from us. They don't exist apart from us. And that's a hard reckoning, to see ourselves as part of that picture, to see ourselves as implicated. That's a hard reckoning, but the payoff, and it's a considerable payoff, is if the problems don't exist apart from us, we have agency. What we do matters. It makes a difference. And so that is really, I think, where we are as a society. And the challenge, and it's a significant challenge, and it's really up to you guys. It's up to all of us, but I think it's particularly up to your generation going forward. The challenge is to generate power in civil society, generate power as citizens, generate power in the way in which we engage with each other, the way in which we talk with each other, to affect these conditions, intolerable conditions for our fellow citizens, that we in varying degrees are implicated in, acquiesce in, but could be otherwise, could be different. And that's really the challenge looking forward. Looking back, there have been some significant progress. I never imagined that there would be an historic opening like we're living through right now. I really never, I've spent many years, decades, addressing these issues and writing about them and advocating, and I never expected a time like this, when there's actually an opening for fundamental enduring change with respect to the hardcore sort of blood knot of racial issues of racial justice in American society. We have to elevate our games to be worthy of that opportunity, but it's an extraordinary opportunity in your time, now. And everything positive that's happened over the last 5 years in terms of change or a direction of change, greater transparency, new mechanisms of accountability, has been the product of citizen energies. We have not been led to this point by, inspired political leadership. It's been citizen energies, and that's the path forward. That's the path forward, and the paradox is that, this is in some ways a terrible moment in that we're confronting profound and difficult harms, but it's also an extraordinary moment, an extraordinary opportunity. And, one final observation then, I would love to hear questions, challenges, comments, but the part of what makes this moment sort of daunting is, again, the blame dynamic is morally satisfying. It's morally satisfying to stand in judgment of people who do bad things. And this other process is more challenging. First, as I mentioned, because we have to see ourselves as part of the problem, but also as having agency and responsibility in relation to it. But then the other thing, and I've encountered this many times, particularly talking to younger people, is when people comprehend the gravity of the harms, just how terrible, it is to live under a police regime, as some communities do. When we perceive the gravity of the harms, there's a natural human desire to want remedies that are commensurate with the harms, want some big transformative thing that we can do. And others may disagree with me. There are people who dream of revolution or abolition of the police. But in my view, those big transformative things just aren't on the menu. They're just not available. And as I once wrote in another context, there are big violent acts, but there are no big healing acts. Healing is a matter of care and attention and small acts of mindfulness over time. And that's what we're dealing with now. So the challenge is to see the large possibilities that can be achieved by a whole bunch of seemingly relatively small and particular interventions and remedies that are maybe seem minor in isolation, but in the aggregate are, I think, the only way that systems and cultures change. So there's a path going forward, but it really requires the best energy, the moral passion, the ingenuity, and a kind of deep clarity from us to make sure that we realize this opportunity. And as I say, as somebody who has worked long and hard on these issues, I never expected there to be a moment like this. So it's really up to us to inhabit it and travel that path together. Thanks, and I welcome questions or comments. There are microphones for anybody who...
I'm an industrial organizational psychologist as well as your provost, and so power is always interesting to me, and I love what you're talking about, generative power. And I'm thinking at a city level or in a community level, it's easier to create that generative power as people come together in community and recognize that they're part of a community. I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about how you do that at kind of the state or national level to create that generative power. As cops often say when you talk to them about accountability issues, that's over my pay grade. I'm kidding. No, because I think intensely locally. I think through place. I think through particular situations. And I think what we've demonstrated with our practice, and I hope with my reporting,
that it's possible to do really immersive, intensely focused work that has national resonance. So, my belief about these, and the other thing I should say is that God knows there are national issues in terms of racial disparities in the criminal justice system, but there are only local solutions. Law enforcement is a local phenomena. And so, our work with my colleagues at the Invisible Institute, much of the work we've done in Chicago and Cook County has been meant to be a sort of demonstration project that has larger implication, but it's really by staying intensely focused that we've been effective. But I do think to your basic point that there are things that we can only do together that we can't do alone, and the generation of that kind of civil society power is very centrally and essentially that. There are things that we can do together. There's unrealized power in this room, on this campus, in this city, that we don't have to cozy up to power. We don't have to seek to wrest power from others. We actually can generate power. In 1968, with the student demonstrations around the world, there in Paris, the slogan was "Power is in the streets," and it didn't mean anarchic power. It meant civil society power. It's in the streets.
Thank you, Jamie. At dinner, we talked a bit about narrative entrapment, and you're
going to give up my trade secrets?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I am, because as I mentioned to you at dinner, I assigned the 4-part series Code of Silence to some students to read, and it's not a normal series on bureaucracy and the way that corruption is difficult to uncover that actually captures the imagination of a reader, but that series does, and that approach of narrative entrapment and your emphasis on us needing to understand this bigger picture as a narrative in which we live and move really strikes me as something we need to grasp well in order to communicate with others about what's going on. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about both those pieces, the big picture of the narrative and the smaller approach or rhetoric of narrative entrapment.
Yeah, okay. So first, the larger point is, to state it really simply, among the central ways in which power imposes itself is through narrative, through a story it tells about the world. And one of the powerful tools we have to push back at power when it's malignly used is to contest the narrative, to generate counter narratives, to penetrate the narrative. I was joking at dinner, but it's not really a joke, that in my experience of pushing back at official narratives, particularly in the Laquan McDonald context, you sort of feel this is incredibly powerful gravitational field you're operating in, and you feel like 80-90% of institutional capacity in government is invested in maintaining a world of appearances that's at odds with observable reality. Things that you can actually go report on, touch, smell, assess with your nerve endings. And, so a lot of my work has been directed, going back to years I spent reporting out of public housing in Chicago, and sort of attacking the disconnect between policy discourse in the sort of mid-level abstract place and observable reality on the ground. We published a kind of human rights report from starting in about 2000 for 5 or 6 years from high-rise public housing in its last chapter in Chicago that we called The View from the Ground. There is a view from the ground, and it's pretty powerful. You know, if you're really situated, immersed, know what you know about a particular place, a particular human situation. In terms of narrative entrapment, you know, I was half joking at dinner that that's kind of what I do as a reporter and try to do as a public voice, is to carry people to places they might not choose to go if you just sort of stated the topic, right? You know, bureaucratic evils and there are consequences. So again, having a story that is almost like a vehicle, you know, a portal, a way in. And I experience this as a reader as well as try to practice it as a writer. And I'm often incredibly grateful to writers who do that for me. You know, who the writing is of such quality from sentence to sentence. The narrative is propulsive in a way that carries me. And I find myself, you know, learning about things that I think I would not have readily absorbed or digested had they been presented to me in a different way. So we live through narrative, we think through narrative. You know, I am certainly capable and have done a lot of work of a more purely analytic nature, particularly in legal scholarship and stuff. But I actually think narrative, well managed and deployed, we can be smarter through narrative. We can capture more of the world's complexity and messiness and, you know, through story than we can through other modes of inquiry. And that's not to, you know, devalue other modes of inquiry. So, yeah, I mean, I am always looking to seduce with story. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I am not faculty. I'm just here. I think my basic question is, who's writing about Chicago do you read? Are there entities in Chicago engaging in or calling for the sort of systemic analysis you've recommended? And if so, how does the Invisible Institute interact with them?
So that's a full menu. You know, there are a number. I have various journalistic colleagues and friends who are passionate about Chicago, who I read just right off the top of my head in terms of the kinds of themes we're talking about. There's a writer named Ben Austin who recently wrote a book on the last days of Cabrini Green, the housing development, who's a marvelous magazine writer, and I'm happy to say as a fellow at the Invisible Institute now. Alex Kotlowitz, you know, some of you will know of Alex, and I recommend his book, An American Summer, which is really the, you know, I think the most deeply felt, and again, almost purely narrative journalism about violence in Chicago currently. The Invisible Institute is sort of an odd and interesting entity, and if you've looked at our website, you can probably gather that, in that it really arises out of my practice as a journalist, and then at some point we kind of instituted it as an actual nonprofit organization. And I first, you know, because I mentioned The View from the Ground, I first used the term Invisible Institute in about 2000 as a wisecrack. So when we started publishing The View from the Ground, which was this kind of human rights documentation, I described it as being published under the auspices of the Invisible Institute. And if you guys will forgive me, it was a slight, you know, sneer gesture towards academia, think tanks, research, you know, entities. And people just love the name. And it has followed me around since then. And it came to be associated with a kind of loose association of journalists and civil rights attorneys and activists who were, doing work together. And then in 2014, as was mentioned, we won a big lawsuit against the city that resulted in a decision that police misconduct files are public information subject to only, reasonable redaction, somebody's social security number, home address, but the names of officers are public. And I don't much care for titles when people describe me as the founder of the Invisible Institute. I blush because if they knew the organic process by which it came into being, it was hardly founded. But I do like the name of this lawsuit, which is Kalven versus Chicago. That has a certain resonance for me. So when we won that lawsuit, it actually became a matter of just sort of responsibility to the information that we needed to be kind of worthy of that moment. So we institutionalized and did serious fundraising and staffed up. But the journey has sort of continued in that I particularly, but my colleagues as well, have been really focused on mission, really focused on mission. And all sorts of things have happened as a byproduct of the mission. So, and the mission is to enhance the capacity of citizens to hold public institutions accountable. That's how we understand it. But in the course of that, we won this big lawsuit and created something, and I urge you to look at it, called the Citizens Police Data Project, which is a public-facing database where we've housed all this information. I ended up co-producing a documentary for Showtime on the Laquan McDonald case. We have the Harith Augustus exhibition, which was part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and we did in collaboration with an extraordinary human rights group in London called Forensic Architecture, a group that uses the tools of architecture, like 3D modeling and various kinds of spatial, minute spatial precision for as investigative tools in human rights crimes around the world. We have a big podcast series coming out next year, early next year, an investigative podcast series, and I'm writing and consulting with an AMC television series on criminal justice in Chicago, a dramatic series. I mention this just because all of those things are byproducts. We didn't set out to make movies or do this sort of high-end art installation that we ended up doing in the context of the biennial, et cetera, et cetera. It all sort of has been a byproduct, which makes it a really interesting moment to be, an entity like the Invisible Institute. So we're not a conventional news outlet. We do major projects. We practice what we think of as journalism as intervention in the public realm, but we don't compete with other journalists so much as try to enrich the ecosystem. I don't know if that's responsive, but so it's been a kind of magical mystery tour. It's been an interesting ride, and I'm not sure what comes next. Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to be part of the change. Can you recommend one tangible thing I can do to move in that direction?
Sure. Well, there are all sorts of community groups in Chicago, and I can put you in touch with some. One thing I didn't mention that really bears mentioning is there's something called a consent decree process in Chicago, which is a product of all the advocacy and agitation and investigation flowing from the Laquan McDonald case. So I won't go through all the legal ins and outs of how we got there, but now, despite the hostility of the Trump Justice Department, there is a federal judge overseeing the process of reform of the Chicago Police Department. And, a consent decree is like the settlement of a lawsuit. So the city has agreed to a kind of blueprint for reform over a period of years. And there's a police monitor team that will oversee that. But there's the enforcement power of a federal judge. And that has emerged as a really, really important vehicle going forward. And I think, first becoming informed about that, but citizen input becomes really, really important in that. The danger is that the consent decree process will be like a checklist. And we're just ticking things, progress is, okay, we said we were going to do this, and now we've instituted that training module at the academy. And the challenge, and I think it is a challenge, but I think, again, it wholly depends on citizen energies and civil society energies, is to make it really a living document, to make it a vehicle for the kind of enduring change that is possible now. And there are all sorts of points where citizens can engage with that process, and it's potentially really exciting. And I use the example at dinner, but I think it's really pertinent, and it relates to the question about narrative as well, is that I often think in this context of Dr. King and his allies. A couple of years ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Selma March. And, what they were inspired at was creating a larger narrative, a public narrative, in which people could see themselves and their action, their support mattering. But the truth is, Selma, in a very close parallel to the sort of police reform process, was about the Voting Rights Act. It was about very granular particulars. It was about the poll tax. It was about using literacy tests as a bar to enfranchisement, other things that were meant to deflect black voters. And we haven't succeeded in doing that with police, that kind of narrative. I hope there's a little bit of that resonance in our conversation today. This is big, it matters. People's lives are at stake. There are things that we can do tomorrow and the next day and the next day that will reduce the probability of harms that will otherwise inevitably occur. Harms that will absolutely occur. And we don't know who the victims will be. And there's something, compelling but counterfactual about human rights work. Human rights work take the form of intensely examining and scrutinizing terrible things that happen, the Laquan McDonald killing, Harith Augustus, not because we have any hope of justice for those individuals or bringing them back or undoing what happened, but because that's the only way in which we can reduce the probability in the future. The fulfillment, when I wake up in the middle of the night and wonder what my life has been about, the sort of consoling thought I have is that maybe in some small way, our work has contributed to things that otherwise would have happened that haven't happened. And so the small stuff really matters. The small stuff really matters. And I think there's I have this conversation with dear friends and colleagues in the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, the vision of abolition of the police as this big transformative thing, which I think has been immensely useful to have in the conversation. I think it creates imaginative space for all of us. It creates space to think about alternatives, other ways of allocating resources that now go to law enforcement. But where my resistance is I don't want to fail to do the small thing that we can do today that will even marginally reduce the probability of harms tomorrow for unknown individuals. We know certain things about them demographically, racially, but we don't know them by name. And again, I urge people to take a look at the Harith Augustus exhibition. It's all online, so if you go to my reporting on the Intercept or you go to Forensic Architecture's website, the sort of distinct video investigations of the single interaction are all there. But what overwhelmingly, so it's very, very granular, all the different things that contributed to a completely gratuitous, unnecessary, catastrophic killing of a member of the community. The overwhelming perception you come away with is nothing bad would have happened if the police weren't there. There was no harm that they were preventing. And then when you think about that, think about all the or many of the high-profile cases that have defined this era in American life. Michael Brown, Eric Gardner selling loose cigarettes on the streets of New York. What harm occurs? What harm occurs if he's left to sell loose cigarettes compared to what in fact transpired? Tamir Rice, a little boy playing with a toy gun in a park, in a playground for all intents and purposes. Sandra Bland, a broken taillight. You take the police out of those scenarios, Sandra Bland drives on. Tamir Rice continues to play his, imaginary game. So that's not a case for abolition, but it's a case to say, we have the power right now to reduce a whole set of harms. And it's at a very practical and concrete level. And that's really what's dramatized in the Harith Augustus exhibition. And there's so many things that are fixable but haven't been fixed. And it's only, as I say, citizen energy and civil society pressure that will, even with the consent decree and the federal judge and the monitoring team, that just becomes a bureaucratic process if we're not leaning into it and holding them accountable and demanding that this add up to real change. But the real change is possible. It's possible. And, we probably should close. I don't even know what time it is in terms of places people need to get. But the final point is, and they drop out of sight in this, and I mentioned at the outset, we should think about the police in all of this too. It's a pretty crappy job right now to be a police officer for all sorts of reasons, in terms of how the bureaucracy operates, in terms of their working conditions, in terms of how they're perceived in public, in terms of the degree to which their voices are throttled. We don't hear from rank and file officers. There will be a statement from the police union, and they scarcely, so extreme and so polarizing, and the media will report it in a way that suggests that this is what this is the police perspective. Well, it's not. It's not. And so one of the things I so struggle with in our reporting, because you do the kind of reporting that we do, that I myself and my colleagues, and it necessarily, in the nature of things, does damage to the legitimacy of institutions. You can't do the code of silence reporting or the Laquan McDonald, without those, the injury to the credibility and the legitimacy of various institutions. And I think that there's been a drift in the society to see the police. Obviously there are pockets within the society who defend the police whatever happens, and certainly the police union will take the position that if a police shooting occurred, it was justified because it occurred. It's that kind of circular logic, in fact. But then there are lots of people whose confidence in the police, in law enforcement, has been so shaken. And I often think of it on analogy to I spent years and years working in public housing, working with gangs, and found a community as rich, complex, unfathomable as any community I've ever been part of, but that was perceived in light of a handful of bad actors. So the foregrounding of violent acts by a few just eclipsed the reality of human care, solidarity, all the ways in which people were neighborly and decent and provided mutual support to each other, all the more so because they were so utterly abandoned. I think there's a similar way in which we're now doing that to police. And I'm the police critic. I'm the guy doing the exposés. But I think the danger is that we'll see the bad actors, the criminal officers, the racist officers in the foreground, and everybody else is kind of bleached out of the picture and eclipsed. And that's not only unfair in both instances, in both the urban neighborhood situation and looking at the police. It's not only unfair, and it is unfair, it's just demoralizing. It's so demoralizing for us, And so to allow, I don't want to say a few bad apples. It's more than that. I don't want to minimize it, but to allow a relatively small subset of the police department, a relatively small hyperviolent network, within an urban community, to kind of define and sort of essentialize the whole community and our perceptions of it is just a terrible disservice. And that again comes back to narrative and telling more complex and involving stories, because you just sort of lose heart. If that's the nature of inner city black neighborhoods, well, I think a lot of society feels that. And for a widening sector of the society, if that's the nature of police departments, well, what's the hope? But it's not. At any given moment, there are countless countless interactions. Right now, here and in the city of Chicago, there are countless interactions going on between police officers and citizens that are perfectly fine, constructive and at least unexceptional. And we shouldn't lose sight of that while we address the particular harms. And if you look at the Citizens Police Data Project, where we have all this information about police misconduct, the really striking thing is there's such strong patterns. They jump out at you, and the city has had to put tremendous energy into not connecting the dots because it's so it's so easy to see. And as with most crime, the truth is that a very substantial majority of officers have like 0 to 4 complaints against them in their entire careers, and other officers have over 100 complaints. And remember that this is hugely underreported. And then you have cohorts of officers who are teamed together, and they all have a sufficient number of complaints that it can't possibly be a statistical anomaly. These things are knowable. These things are knowable, and we have a responsibility to know them. But if we maximize the available knowledge, there are all sorts of interventions that are possible and things that can be fixed. But if we don't, and this is what we've been living with for generations now, a relatively small number of corrupt and abusive officers can do extraordinary harm. Extraordinary harm to communities and to the institution and to civil society and to the civil order. And so that's really the task ahead of us. And it gets complicated because of a prevailing culture that where otherwise, decent or conscientious officers are almost compelled by their job descriptions to protect the bad actors. But I do, I urge that on you. I was reminded at dinner of something that a police executive in New York said to me years ago. In a democracy, there's nothing as good as a good police officer, and there's nothing as bad as a bad police officer. And I think it's important to keep both of those dimensions in sight as we, try to create a more humane and equal society. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope that we will all take to heart Jamie's message that we should see not only events, incidents, individuals, but also narratives, not only narratives, but how we're entangled with them, and not only our entanglement, but how our entanglement exposes our agency a bit. That we'll take to heart the fact that there are big violent acts, but there are no big healing acts. And it's with our small healing acts that we'll need to, as he reminded us, steward the moment. So thank you, Jamie. Please join me in thanking our guests tonight.